Welcome to this week's episode of the Luke Alfred Show. It's going to be a bit of a departure this week. It's an interview format show for once, and I'm going to be speaking to Ian Raceday, who is sort of a sporting fan extraordinaire. And what we're going to be speaking about this week is the Ellis Park rugby test between the Springboks and the All Blacks, with particular emphasis placed on how things pan out next week. You know, whether the Ellis Park test can provide us with any clues as to the second test match between the two great playing test nations. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. How's it, Ian?
How's it, Luke? And thank you for having me on the podcast this week.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. To get the ball rolling, I was intrigued looking at the game and then looking at the game again, that in a way this was a Springbok victory which was built on traditional virtues.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, and the idea that we rucked and mauled 3 tries, we were gritty, we tackled hard. Peter Steph-Tutoy was man of the match, again, in the same kind of role that he's done in previous games. I think the difference for me is that 10 years ago, if we had played the All Blacks and they were 10 down with 10 to play, we would have been really seriously worried that they were going to pip us at the post, pull back 2 tries and win, because that's what the All Blacks do. They were the team with Dan Carter and
Richie McCaw,
and they did that. They did that to all the teams, and it was frustrating because you think we had them. This was the game we had against them, and we always used to say, if you make one mistake against the All Blacks, they'll make you pay. You can't make any mistakes. This was a game where we made plenty of errors. We gifted them 2 tries, certainly 1, possibly 2. And we were 10 down with 10 minutes to play. And the All Blacks, I think, were fairly certain they had us. And we won. And I think that's what's changed a bit. So I think it's traditional virtues on the one hand, but it's also the new part of the box is we're now that team that other teams look at and think, geez, we had them. And they got away again.
Okay, so you mentioned 2 New Zealand names there, Dan Carter and Kieran Reid, to which I added Richie McCaw. If you were to project yourself 5 years into the future, who would be the 3 key Springbok players that take those mantles? So, in other words, tackles McCaw. Who would become our tackles McCaw? Who are those players? And were they even there on Saturday night? They might not have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, Peter Steph-Tutoy he isn't World Player of the Year, but for many people he should. I don't know how many times he's been man of the match in the past year, and he plays 80 minutes pretty much every time. He played in 3 different positions on Saturday. I think he changed 4 times back between lock and different sides of the scrum. In the moment, I would say, is that kind of like talismanic forward figure who you just know is going to be with you and is going to make a difference in a game. I would like to think if we're looking into the future, maybe we're speaking too soon, but Sasha Feinberg-Ngomazulu is going to be a player. I love the way that he's very calm. Even when he makes terrible mistakes, he just dusts himself off, gets back up, does something amazing. He did some outrageous things on Saturday that they didn't show replays of, that I wish they had. And I wanted to almost go back and think, did you see the little kick off the outside of his shoe or that ridiculous delayed pass that he whipped around his back? He's got those levels of skills that are, for a young player, amazing. So I think he could be a difference maker. The other player now who makes a difference for us, who we might miss, is Colby, who just, again, pops up everywhere, should have scored again, made some amazing tackles, sat Scott Barrett down on his ass, which for a tiny wing is amazing. I think the problem with your question is that right now, Russie's in a position where he's playing the most experienced team, I think, that's ever played rugby internationally. And these are players, and we think, can we get 4 more years out of Peter Steph-Tutoy? Can we get 4 more years out of Evan Etzebeth? The one guy who I really like is Steenekamp, the new prop. I think he's quite an interesting character because he doesn't look like a bruiser. He doesn't look like a 130 kilogram monster, but he was, I think, very impressive on Saturday. He might be a bomb squad member for the next 10 years, I think.
If you were Scott Robertson and you were at one stage 15 minutes into the second half, 27-14 or 27-17 up, and you had that game burgled from under your noses, how do you go about addressing things before the second test?
He will know that they should have won the game. And he will know that they probably deserve to win the game, to be honest. I think their backline was better than us. I think they will look at their penalty count against them. And even small things. You look at these turning points in the game, and not the things like the Bongi Benombi try, no try decision. But things like TJ Perinara getting a penalty against him flat out from the ref for behavior, for etiquette. Now, that is an interesting moment. He wasn't warned. It wasn't a reversal. He flat out said, don't talk to me again. It's a penalty. And I haven't seen that on a rugby field in a long time. And I felt that was an interesting moment because, Perinara is mouthy. Everyone knows that. But it was a sort of interesting moment where Brace was trying to show authority, but it cost New Zealand field position. And the penalty count was heavily in our favour, which is unusual. And I think it could have been worse because I think New Zealand were lucky in the first half with scrums. I think there were 2 scrums where other refs may have penalised them for going down. And Brace said play on, the ball was out, ball's at the 8-man's feet and said play it. And I think we could have got 1, maybe 2 penalties in the first half from that. So he'll look at discipline and not just the number of penalties, but penalties in the wrong place.
One of the things that I think due attention isn't given to in the sort of rugby press and the rugby media and perhaps from the public is the structure of this year's tournament is absolutely lovely.
Yeah.
It's got, so you have appetizers. The South Africans go to Australia, Argentina go to New Zealand, and then you've kind of got the main course. And you've got the main course at Ellis Park, which is a ground filled with history. What do you make of the structure of this year's tournament? It seems almost as good as it could be, and there was a kind of element of World Cup quarterfinal to the game on Saturday night.
Oh yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think we're lucky because I know that the struggle with the tournament is they're trying to obviously cut down on travel. So we are lucky in that in this cycle, we are going to get the benefit of home games.
Yes.
And in the next cycle, we won't. So, if this had been a year where we'd had to play 2 lots of away games, right now, I think a lot of supporters are thinking we can actually do a clean sweep, which I don't think we've done before. We've never done. I don't think New Zealand's ever done before even. So we're in a position to, especially because Argentina is now looking quite weak. They're very inconsistent. They lost on Saturday to a very indifferent Australian side. So we've got to think we're going to win both games against Argentina. We should be confident of. So it now means the Cape Town game becomes a big game for the whole tournament. So I think we're lucky in a way that we're in a position where New Zealand's going through a bit of flux with a new coach and some decisions around players and there's some politics in the backroom that's obviously affecting them. We're in a position where even though Rassi's now taken over as coach again, he's actually been there for 8 years now. We've got a largely experienced team. We've got a few youngsters coming in, and credit to Rassi for the way in which he's kind of managed that transition of older players leaving and new players coming in. So we're not only dominant, but we also have in our favor the fixtures for this year. And even the way they balance it, as you say, Ellis Park is kind of like the Wanderers. It's like the Wanderers in cricket. Ellis Park's the big rugby. It's the bull ring. It's the kind of all our nostalgia about 95 is rooted in this. I wish they wouldn't fly the jumbo over every time. But it's got that charismatic quality. The interesting thing for me coming up in Cape Town is the new stadium going to live up to the kind of character that Newlands used to evoke as an international venue? And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the new stadium develops its character as the right place for New Zealand to play South Africa. I want to think about how I feel after next week's game. Whether I'm going to think, wow, that was an amazing game, Cape Town Stadium's the bomb, it's going to be incredible. Or whether it's going to feel like it doesn't feel like the way it used to at Newlands, or it doesn't feel like a Kings Park or a Loftus.
I suppose it can't feel like Kings Park or Loftus or Ellis Park because it doesn't have that deep an identity as a young stadium. So that's going to sort of happen with time and it will grow into its own identity.
But it hasn't had that. I think that's the thing. It's had such a weird identity up to now. I remember going to Newlands as a boy and, the railway stand and seeing the whites of their eyes and seeing the blood literally dripping out of people's noses if you're in the standing seats. Like very few grounds in the world got you
So
that
that's
close.
not on the field of play.
And that's
What did you do as a spectator in the Western Cape? The blood comes out of your nose.
Oh, jeez.
So that's incredible. I thought the us Valis were the hard men of
those dark, stormy evenings at Newlands when a game gets tense. It was terrifying. It was a violent cauldron. The abuse that you could hear coming from behind you to players who were standing 5 meters away from you. And modern grounds don't really have that. And I'm not saying Newlands was perfect. There were a lot of issues I didn't like about Newlands, but it did have a kind of character.
Of course.
And there was a bit of Mordor about it when the mountain was covered in cloud.
Right.
And the new stadium, it's bright and shiny and new. It hasn't really found its niche yet as a rugby stadium. It feels like a tourist stadium. People come here for sevens and they go here for concerts. And you're right, it'll grow into it perhaps. But I'm interested to see whether it becomes the kind of ground people will want to go and watch rugby tests at and have these kind of memories of iconic test matches. So.
I suppose some of that will be due to how the Springboks perform there in the next 5 to 10 years, which brings me to a question about, do you think SA Rugby are doing all they can to promote the Springboks as and I don't like this phrase, but a sort of an international brand? For example, the age of the meaningless one-off test in Twickenham is over. The European, why are we still wedded to the European tour? Is that a kind of broadcast rights and contractual obligation? I'm kind of answering my own question, so forgive me, but you would think, why are the Springboks not playing in Amsterdam or Lisbon? Why are they not playing in the States? Yeah. Why are they not playing in Chicago or Miami or New York against interesting opposition? Why aren't we doing that stuff?
It's interesting because I think there's two sides to that. I miss, in a way, the tours where we had 3 test series. I mean, everyone wanted a 3rd test against Ireland.
Yeah.
And I remember those tours we used to go to England and go and have a fight against Neath for 40 minutes with an outbreak of rugby in the last 5 minutes, and there'd be a B team, like the dirt tracker team, who's going to graduate from the dirt trackers to the A team for the test series. And those were kind of exciting tours, but they just, unfortunately, in today's environment, they're just not economically viable anymore. No one wants to watch 4 warm-up games against club teams. Sure. So there's now so much emphasis on the test. We played that weird game. It was in Washington, which was really odd. And we played in red. I remember thinking, they were definitely making the effort, and I don't think it was sorry. It was the IRB was making the effort to try and because they're trying to punt the game in America, they're trying to build the market in the States, and so All Blacks have played a game against Ireland, I think, in Chicago. The problem for me in this is that we don't seem to have enough genuine clout in the boardroom decision making to determine where those games are going to take place. We seem to follow a lot of the time. The schedule for the next season is announced, and we're kind of like, we're happy with the schedule. We're not the ones dictating the schedule as world champions, saying we demand like a 3-test series against New Zealand. And also because the uniqueness of rugby is this kind of Lions cycle, means that the Lions this year go to Australia.
Next year.
Yeah, imagine if the Lions were coming to us next.
Yeah.
So I think because of the way in which the Lions cycle is built, which is a Northern Hemisphere dictate, it works that way because it's worked that way for decades. I often find that we're reacting to a pre-existing circumstance in terms of broadcast and in terms of schedules, and maybe that's part of the problem.
In the 2007 World Cup squad, Jake White's squad, there were finally 32 players because there were a couple of players flown in because of pre-existing injuries. One of them was a so-called black African. Akona Ndangani.
Yes.
Where and how has South African rugby been able to refashion itself, reimagine itself as a game which is synonymous with a democratic South Africa, as opposed to the game that was seen as a representation of Afrikaner kragdadigheid and might?
I saw a really interesting article the other day about Craven Week and about the fact that the Craven Week model has been going for so long, and that it doesn't occur in other countries in the world. No other country has something the equivalent of Craven Week, where literally the whole country's schools kind of pyramid up to this particular week of rugby, and it produces, of the 300 and whatever kids who are playing at Craven Week, that is the future of Bok rugby. And you're seeing this extraordinary array of talent from all over the country, whereas before it would have been a couple of like the big white schools. Now it's kids from country districts, from Eastern Province. It's the kind of kids where Kilisi, who was a boy who went to Grey PE ultimately, would have come through the system. I think Craven Week's a very, very important event for creating and channeling talent. The agents are there now. Kids are getting picked up out of Craven Week to go straight overseas. So the factory is, I think, one of the most powerful factories for rugby anywhere in the world. The downside of that, or the inversion of that, is that a lot of those players, a guy like Khaleesi, is a guy who gets picked up and goes to Grey College and gets kind of, in a way, handpicked and selected to become the player he is now. And maybe we're still overlooking the quality of players. That said, Kurtley Arendse was working as a butcher assistant a year and a half before the World Cup, and he's now one of the world's dominant wingers. So the Cravenbeck model, which was always there, is now working to produce more broader and a more diverse array of talent, which is feeding into the provincial system. But I also think the move towards Europe in the club game has been interesting. I mean, and a big discussion needs to be had is what has been the effect, and maybe this is the bounce back to you. What has been the effect of South African teams not competing in Super Rugby anymore? Has it been beneficial for us to switch to URC? I have the impression that it's been a negative for New Zealand and Australia that we're not there anymore. And we don't seem to have lost out. I don't think it's cost us anything at the moment. It's cost them. But have we also benefited from going to Europe, from playing in Europe?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly we've gained because we're playing in different conditions largely. You know, you're playing in Galway or Limerick in Ireland and the wind is blowing and it's 5 degrees and the rain is belting down. You can't kick the ball out of your half. It's great for us. It's new challenges. I think the New Zealanders and the Australians have made a terrible mistake to let us go. And I think playing against the Bulls and playing against Fiji are not comparable. And I think we've been savvy about it.
Yeah.
We've brought to the competition, but we've also gained from the competition. You know, you look at particularly the Irish sides, to a slightly lesser extent, perhaps the Warriors in Scotland. They also play a very different game of rugby. They play a highly regimented, very if you like, coach-heavy type of rugby. This is one of the interesting things for me with South African rugby at the moment, is that I find it quite lyrical. And Rassie, in part, has been pragmatic enough or wise enough or combination of both to actually say, you know, go out and express yourself. We're not going to be freaked out by that. Peter de Villiers actually tried to do that to some degree, but he didn't have the respect of the players, or he did it too soon, or our confidence levels weren't high enough to justify an offload game. But it's actually clicked for us, and that's good. I mean, can you imagine a Sasha with his background, his pedigree? His grandfather was an ANC activist. He was a Betoega offshore for many years. Then the grandson goes to Bishops.
Yeah.
A product, if you like, for want of a better word, like Sasha, could not have been delivered out of South African society 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And Sasha is, in a way, the answer to the question I put to you 10 minutes ago.
I mean, I think what's interesting about him, I don't know if you saw his little post-match comments. He did an interview in the locker room. And what I loved about his attitude is that, again, no platitudes. His first point was, man, that was a dogfight out there. And he was in awe of the fact that he's had this opportunity to play against New Zealand at Ellis Park. So on the one hand, he's humble enough to enjoy that experience, but also on the field, totally confident enough to drill a 60-meter penalty, that amazing touch finder in the last 5 minutes. You know, even though he butchered some other stuff, he doesn't worry about it. He's got that mental set. And I think part of that is because he's unburdened. I mean, he plays as if, in a way, everything is new. And I like that about him. But going back to an earlier point, it's interesting you made me talked about the Bulls and playing the Fijis and the same. I think one of the problems was 10 years ago that if you'd said, well, Leinster is the equivalent of the Crusaders, people would have laughed at you. There were these two leagues, and there was this kind of thought about what happens if the best Super Rugby side played against the best Heineken Cup side. You know, and in those days, I feel that those, you know, the Crusaders were the sort of, you know, they won so many championships in the Rugby Championship. But Leinster's now easily competitive at that level. And so I think the game in Europe, the kind of teams we're playing, when we're playing Munster, I went to that URC final in Newlands. I mean, that was a big game. Munster are international pedigree. And so the top of the Heineken Cup, the top of that level is now comparable to what used to be the top in Super Rugby. So that's where we haven't lost. I think we would have lost if we'd been there 10 years ago. But where we are now, I think it's making a huge difference. And I think Australia is actually the one that's losing the most. New Zealand will be fine, but Australian rugby is now really, really struggling. And it's interesting to see whether they can turn it around, if they maybe win another game or two. The Bledisloe Cup's going to be a fascinating contest this year. And if Australia can win one of those, there might be a sense that they can actually pull something back and develop, but they have to win something.
It's very interesting, you know, sport is about many things, you know, about talent, power, luck. But it's also about geography. And you see it in European football. You see it in Indian cricket. And you see it in Northern Hemisphere rugby. That in a way, Northern Hemisphere rugby, European football, Indian cricket sucks other things towards it through the IPL, through the Champions League, etc. And I make the point because New Zealand and Australia are very liminal. They are very peripheral to the main currents of power, influence, and money in the game of world rugby. And they have to be very, very careful because strategically, I think they've made a profound error.
I'm going to end off with a question for you. You talked about the bomb squad earlier, about how the bomb squad made a difference when it came on. This game's bomb squad is a bit different because it didn't really work to plan. There were a couple of players who had to come off at awkward times. They had to bring players back on. They didn't want to play Etzebeth as early as they had to. They had to switch to Steph to toy around a bit.
And there was clearly a problem with Malcolm Marx.
Yes.
Which I haven't read about anywhere. I haven't seen anywhere. He was not throwing into the line out as he should have. So it was as though he was nursing an arm or a shoulder injury. He was throwing very flat. And I don't think the All Blacks took advantage of that if they saw it.
And Khaleesi didn't want to go off. There was a moment where Khaleesi looked like he was going off and he stayed on. And I thought, he's going to play 80. And then they did that switch that eventually took him off, switched to Steph to try backboard Swithman. Two things about that. So the first question is, given the fact that Khaleesi's now been playing for a long time, he's a double World Cup winning captain, he's kind of achieved everything he's going to achieve in terms of rugby and where he is in his career and his physical fitness. Are we better when he's not on the field in the late in the game? And part of the answer to that is, I think even when the bomb squad doesn't work, it's Rassie's ability to adapt in the moment with the reserves that he has that I think sets him apart. That's what Robertson hasn't got right. And what Rassie gets right every single game. The bomb squad doesn't always work, and yet he somehow manages to fix it.
Look, I think there's a simple answer to that in a way, that the South African bench just has more depth and talent than the New Zealand bench. And I think there is a great deal of creativity in the way it is used, but I don't necessarily think it went according to plan. I think you're quite right when it came to Ellis Park. As far as the first half of the question is concerned, and Sia, I just think in terms of presence and in terms of galvanizing the side and for attracting a sort of a new South African consensus to rugby, Sia is immensely valuable. And I don't think that can be underestimated. I think you could make an argument for the fact that if you were to choose the 15 best rugby players in South Africa, Sia might not be amongst them.
Which was the debate about Francois Pienaar.
But, big players offer other things. Charisma.
Because there's no doubt he's one of he's approaching one of the best ever captains of all time in rugby. I mean, he's just in terms of the titles alone, but his charisma is immense. And I think part of the problem for Rassie is he's got captains in the team who are capable. I think he's found his answer to the Sia problem when Sia is no longer playing a full game or starting. I think he hasn't really solved that yet. Having someone who's got exactly that charisma, the ability to bring people to the game from all walks of life, that ability to attract in, I don't know who that person is.
Look, you can also look at it in different ways. You can sort of look from the outside in, but you can also look from the inside out. So you look from the outside in and you say, well, perhaps we haven't found a plausible alternative to Sia from within the side itself. But by the same token, rugby and big rugby games provide people with opportunities to stick up their hands. And you've seen it historically. Dwayne Vermeulen, 2019 World Cup final, Dwayne Vermeulen was the man. Martin Johnson in 2003 when England won, alongside Johnny Wilkinson. Clearly there was a situation in which Martin Johnson said, okay, this is the second half. We're going to be known or we're going to be forgotten for this 40 minutes. And I make a decision now, and my decision is we're going to be known because England are going to beat Australia in their paddock to win the World Cup. So cometh the moment, hey?
Yeah. What I love about the situation is that I've heard quite a few overseas commentators say, well, Rassie's been lucky with his splits, the 6-1, the 6-2-7-1 split, because he very seldom has to deal with a terrible injury that messes it up. To which I say, rubbish. He's had to deal with it all the time. The World Cup final, for a start, where he loses his hooker in the second minute and has to play a 37-year-old flank convert for the rest of the game. Saturday at Ellis Park was a mess in terms of subs, and he made it work. He's got a couple of specialists and a whole raft load of Swiss Army knives in the bench that he can maneuver around. And he's quite deft at how he does it with things like blood bin replacements, and which he used on Saturday with Ruan Nokia going off and coming back on again. And I think that's been the great strength for him, is that, and also there's no ego. Sia knows he's going to go off at some point. It's not like he's disappointed or he's fighting it. It's planned. Like, they know what's going to happen, and they know that they're going to win the game by doing that. And the more they keep winning, like they did on Saturday, games that they shouldn't, the more they know that system works.
If Saturday was a game they shouldn't have won, do you think they'll repeat the trick on Saturday coming? I'm
anxious about Saturday because it's part of the thing about the stadium. It's going to be a noisy, vibey crowd, but I don't know whether it's going to have the intensity that Ellis Park has. And we very seldom beat the All Blacks twice in a row. So if we manage to do them twice, in 2 weeks, that's going to be a major victory for us. I've got to learn as a South African sports fan to trust my team. It's taken me a while to do that. Too many broken hearts. And now I've got a team, I think, actually, we should just trust these guys. They seem to kind of be able to do it. They did it 3 times by points in the World Cup. They've done it again now. If I actually put that part of my head on, I think we can win on Saturday. Because we'll find a way. Rassie will find a way. The players will find a way. They'll find that man to stand up. It'll be a Peter Steff, or it'll be a Kwacha in the second half, or it'll be Cheslin, there's always going to be a player. There's so many players in that team at the moment who can be that person in the moment. Grant Williams, that kid is dangerous. And I think we've even seen the beginning of how dangerous he can be in the last 10 minutes.
Ian, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Luke.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.